It's Lars Larson. Thanks for listening to my podcast and for listening to the Lars Larson Show.
Reparations in the form of lineage-based compensation is not a compensation for racism. Let's be very clear. If we open the door to racism, Hispanics can come in, Asians can come in, Middle Eastern people can come in. It will become affirmative action again, where we are left holding the crumbs and everybody else is holding the cake.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Those are some of the comments in the big debate in California, in which the state of California activists are demanding that the state of California pay literally hundreds of millions of dollars to every single black resident in reparations. And why? Because of slavery and because of discrimination that followed after slavery for more than 150 years. And does anybody think that's sensible? Well, apparently the activists do. I certainly do not. And in fact, California, where slavery was never legal, where there were no slave owners, there were no slaves themselves, and yet California has decided that its citizens have to pay the cost of reparations for all of that. Welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and it's my pleasure to be with you. And if you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, you're always welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Even as the man suggested in that soundbite, that what you end up with is a very thorny problem. Do you only qualify people who descended directly from slaves? Do you then end up qualifying other people who suffered some kind of racial, discrimination over the decades? And how much is it going to cost exactly? Are we literally talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars per person? $120 billion a year? Take a listen to that second soundbite, please.
The bond fund has $2.9 billion. All we're asking for is $120 billion because I'm demanding that we have $5,000 every single month to the day we die. That's $120 billion a year to stimulate this economy here in the state of California forever.
Now, do you know what's especially crazy about this? The economy of California has been one of the most vigorous economies in the world. They have said that if California was its own country, instead of being one of the 50 states, it would actually rank close to the top 10 in the world because it's a vigorous economy. It has natural resources, which are largely locked up by the green policies of California. It has a workforce, or it used to have a workforce. It had an educated population. Well, it used to. It doesn't as much anymore. It has tremendous weather. It has tremendous scenery. It has tremendous just about everything there is to recommend a state. And now it has become the home to some of the greatest percentages of poverty in America. And the way you're going to stimulate it, that's what the gentleman is talking about, is Keynesian economics, which is a fancy way of saying if we just pump enough money into the economy, it'll make the engine of California go. No. If you pump a bunch of money into the economy, what you end up with is everybody who can possibly leave a state, and there are an awful lot of successful people who are leaving the state of California. I don't happen to live there. I haven't lived there since I was a little kid, and I only lived there for a short period of time, both in Southern California and Northern California. But the fact is, the economy would go on its own if you could just get government out of the way. But the burdens that are being put on citizens of that state, California, under Gavin Newsom and under the craziness that comes out of their state legislature in Sacramento, is a great example of how to wreck a great state. In any case, glad to have you with me. Let me tell you what's coming up this hour. And of course, you're always welcome to call at 866-HEY-LARS. In fact, since Charles is calling in on reparations, let's go right to Charles first. Charles, what do you say to this question of whether or not today's taxpayers should extract tax money from citizens at the point of a gun who've never once owned a slave and pay it to people who've never once been a slave? What should we say to that?
I totally disagree with that. I don't think that's a logical, answer to any of these problems. I'm a Mexican-American, and, the same could be said for land that was won as the spoils of a war.
Yep.
This just going to open the door for everybody to come in and say, well, now, since I'm Mexican, California owes me money for stealing my people's land or whatever the case may be. It's Pandora's box, and once it's open, there's no closing it. And this state's already, dealing with enough of a burden from, financial, leeches, I guess, if you will. And I just don't think it's the right answer.
I'm glad you used that term, Charles, because I think it's accurate. If you end up with a state full of people who expect the government to be the be-all and end-all, I mean, California, as I said, I lived there a couple of times when I was a little kid, but it's a great state from a distance. It's got the weather, it's got the scenery, it's got the mountains, it's got the natural resources like oil off its coastline, which the liberals don't want you to even go out and get. It has or had a really great, vigorous workforce that would go out and make all kinds of things, grow the best agriculture, huge amount of agriculture that comes out of California, the movie business and everything else. And all they've succeeded in doing in the governing of California is to screw the whole thing up and make it a big poverty state. California, as I understand it, has percentages of poverty that actually eclipse every other state in America. Would you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree, Lars. Those are very valid points. And, I think this is just going to create more problems in the long run than solutions. And I think this is something we should totally just steer away from because, as I said, once this Pandora's box is open, there's no going back. And it's just going to create more and more people who feel entitled to the same. And, go out, get a job, work your butt off. I'm 38. I have 6 kids. I work a full-time job. And I take care of everything on my own. Between my wife and I, we don't have any social, services that help us. We buckle up, and every morning strap up our boots and go to work, and we feed our family. And it's through hard work we've been able to buy a house and are very self-sufficient. And I think everybody else has the ability to do the same thing if they're willing to put in the time and the energy. Unfortunately, a lot of people nowadays just want to suckle off the government eat, and it's easier to sit at home and play video games or look at social media than it is to go out and get a job and earn what you want. And
absolutely right. And Charles, very nicely said. Glad to have you with me on a Monday. If you want to dial in, it's 866 Hey Lars. You want something scary? And this was set in motion largely by Barack Obama, continued by Joe Biden. An attempt to stop it by Donald Trump. The Islamic Republic of Iran now has enough uranium already enriched to produce 5 nuclear weapons. That is a game changer when the mad mullahs of Tehran have nuclear weapons. Yes, the people who on a regular basis threaten to kill the United States, to wipe it out and wipe out its people, and to wipe out the people of our ally Israel, and they've got enough material to make 5 nukes. This is absolutely crazy. As Benjamin Netanyahu put it when he was talking to a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers, Iran is 50 North Koreas. It's not just a neighborhood bully like a dynasty that runs North Korea. Coming up in a moment, General Michael Flynn has been the target of the U.S. government for supporting Donald Trump, and now he's facing trial. But why is the government trying to move that trial out of Florida? We'll get to that in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have to tell you something. I like General Michael Flynn. Never met the guy. Know him only by reputation. Know what was done to him by the U.S. government. And now we've got a case coming up against him. Tracy Beans joins me now from Uncover DC that does fantastic investigative reporting, not just on the nation's capital, but other places. Tracy, welcome back.
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me. Actually, in this case, General Flynn is suing the government for malicious prosecution.
Yep.
It's a tort lawsuit for over $50 million in damages. And he's suing them because they maliciously prosecuted him, and the Justice Department admitted they had no predicate to even begin the investigation into him in the first place. So he brought this suit in the Middle District of Florida, where he resides, and the government's first filing in the case was change of venue, Lars. They want to move the case to D.C., but the list of reasons is almost comical. Shall I go through some of them with you?
I will, but I want to say this, Tracy. When the U.S. government pursued him, people should understand. They knew, the FBI knew, Comey knew, the rest of them knew Flynn had committed no crime. And they went after him. He didn't cave easily. So they said, well, we'll go after your family. I mean, it started to sound like a third world dictatorship where you have to fear your own government, and where if your government can't get you, they'll threaten your family until you cave in. Thank God he got some justice in that process. I think he's entitled to sue for defamation. So go ahead and talk about some of the excuses the government is trying to use to say, oh, you can't have this in Florida. You got to move to the much more friendly environment, friendly for the government of Washington, D.C.
If you remember during his case, because he withdrew a guilty plea that he had made under duress, right? And
Yep.
tons of discovery had come forth in the case that showed that the government was clearly maliciously, pursuing him. And the judge in the case would not accept the DOJ dropping the charges against him. And so they needed to go to this appeals court and everything. So for them to want to move this case back to the same district where the judge held the case open for an exorbitant amount of time against the wishes of the appellate courts, trying to hang on and claw on until Biden hopefully won the election so that they could continue and pick it back up. It's absurd. But the one thing they argue is that because the trial was held, or because the case happened in D.C., most of the documents regarding the case are in D.C., so it would be easier to have the case there. And then in a footnote, Lars, they say, we know technology has basically rendered this point moot, but we wanted to argue it in there anyway because it still does lend itself to a change of venue. Another one, the court calendar in Florida is busier than in D.C., and I find that really hard to believe because there are 1,000 J6 defendants waiting for their cases to be heard in front of that panel of judges. And it's absurd to me that they would even bother with that. The other one was that the witnesses, most of the witnesses that General Flynn may call, all live around D.C., so it would be more convenient for them to have the case heard in a D.C. court, as though Zoom doesn't exist and an attorney can't fly to depose witnesses elsewhere. This case is going to be heard in front of a judge. There is no jury trial in this kind of a case, so a judge will hear it. So it's not so important that a jury see these witnesses testifying. It's a judge making the decision. They also argue that General Flynn doesn't actually really spend most of his time in Florida and spends a lot of it in Rhode Island. But even if that were true, which I don't believe it is, it's not Washington, D.C. It's Rhode Island.
Yeah, take it to Rhode Island. Well, tell me this. Who actually makes the decision? Is it a Florida judge that will make the decision, or is it a D.C. judge?
It is a Florida judge. It's the judge the case is in front of right now, and this little nugget didn't help them either. They basically told the judge that she doesn't know the law that it will be at issue here, as well as the D.C. judges would. Now, this
they know how to make friends,
court.
Don't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, if that were the case, you wouldn't be able to try any federal case that a U.S. attorney brought anywhere but D.C. It's absurd. So,
it is crazy. And the venue, by the way, the venue shopping that the liberals do all the time. Why do they go all the way to Hawaii to find a federal judge to rule on something involving Donald Trump? And you say because the federal judge in Hawaii seemed to be incredibly well disposed toward the Democrats' appeals to, call various things unconstitutional and to rule against them and try to shut down things like the so-called Muslim ban and others. Why'd you go all the way to Honolulu? Oh, because that guy's friendly to us. They do this kind of thing all the time. Flynn is saying, I live in Florida. I want to bring the case in Florida. The government can come to me. I see nothing wrong with that.
Not only that, Lars, there are witnesses from all over the world in this case. Svetlana Lakova was the person they accused Flynn of having an affair with overseas that they used as compromise against him. It was a complete and total fabrication. She lost her reputation and has been fighting to get it back ever since. Same thing with the businessman that they accused of working for the Turkish government, who had nothing to do with the Turkish government, named Akim Alptekin. He's over there right now, indicted here in the United States, unable to see his family. His business partner, Bijan Kian, has had his case dismissed twice by the court in D.C., and the Justice Department keeps on appealing and bringing it back. So they're on the warpath here. And honestly, if their arguments about distance, et cetera, were true, zero business would have occurred in the U.S. government during the years that we were locked down due to COVID. There would
No,
be no court cases. There would be no trials.
they can do it remotely. It's not a problem. And all they're trying to do is find a more favorable venue, aren't they? And is there, I guess I've always wondered, Tracy, I mean, it comes up occasionally, but is there any penalty when one of the sides says, look, we want to move to a place that's more friendly to our point of view? Do federal judges take that seriously?
It depends. Venue is always the first thing that comes up in cases like this. Especially if you're suing big tech, they always want to move it to San Francisco and California and out there in Silicon Valley. It's every single case. So it's pretty customary, but the way they did this and the way they basically insulted the Middle District of Florida when they wrote this change of venue motion, it reeks of desperation. The entire motion does. I think it'll be denied. The case will continue in Florida. But Flynn has to respond to this motion by May 30th. So we'll await his response, and we'll go from there.
Well, just look at it this way, because, Tracy, we have lots and lots of civil rights cases over the years. In this case, his civil rights were violated because when you have the government come after you and say, we're going to cook up a case, the case isn't real at all. We're going to run this guy through the ringer. We're going to run him almost broke. Then we're going to threaten his family. That's the kind of thing where whether you agree with Donald Trump, because Flynn did work for Trump as well, and would have been a game changer in the Trump White House, and the loss of him, I still blame in part on Mike Pence, because Mike Pence didn't do his due diligence and say to the FBI, well, what did Flynn lie about? Show me the transcript. Show me what you've got. He never did that, and Flynn got thrown under the bus. That kind of treatment of any American citizen deserves some kind of compensation, I think.
Agreed. It's really a hands-down case in this because, honestly, the government admitted in its filing to drop the charges there was no predicate to bring the investigation. A 1001 violation has to be material to the investigation being investigated. It has to be material to it. The DOJ had the transcripts of the call they were questioning General Flynn about with the Russian ambassador. They knew what he said in it already. So even if he did lie, Lars, which he didn't, it wouldn't have been material to what they were investigating because they knew what he said already via transcript. So
yeah, in fact,
it's
they
a
had
slam dunk for him.
They had some top FBI. Is there any chance Comey gets called so we can hear him tell one? He gets called, right?
Yes, 100% yes. Comey, Brennan, Clapper, Strzok, Pienka, Page, all of them, the whole merry band.
Gee, it seems like that would be really fun to watch CNN report on the coverage of Clapper and some of these jokers that they've actually used as some of their talking heads. Tracy, great coverage in Uncover DC. That is Tracy Beans, who is the editor of Uncover DC, and we always appreciate him. Coming up in a moment, we'll talk about Joe Biden and his direct assault on quality of life for average Americans, including, for goodness sake, your dishwasher. It's next on the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. If you thought that you were going to escape from Joe Biden because you don't make that much money, you don't make $400,000 a year, well, Joe's going to tax you. And if you thought, well, I'll get away with it because Joe can't really touch me, except he's touched your wages through inflation. He's touched your gasoline and diesel fuel at the pump. He's touched all of that stuff. And you know what? Now he's coming for your dishwasher. And I have to tell you, I really like dishwashers. And one of the reasons I like dishwashers is when I was a little kid, I got assigned the job from about the time I could stand on a footstool in front of the kitchen sink and wash dishes. I got assigned the job of washing the family's dinner dishes. And I got reasonably good at it. But one of the things you should know about washing dishes, if you wash them in the sink, with one sink full of soapy water and the other sink full of rinse water, you are still going to use more water to wash your nightly or daily dishes than you would if you just put them in the dishwasher and let the dishwasher do the job. Now, I figure they wrecked dishwashers a long time ago because the government came in and they said, well, we don't like all these phosphates in the detergent, in both laundry detergent and dishwasher detergent. Now, be prepared, folks. This may be more about dishwashers than you ever wanted to hear in your life, but they took a lot of the phosphates out. And they said, look, it's environmentally sensitive. And you say, yeah, and it doesn't make the dishes clean. So then the government regulators, this is all a result of government regulation, said, well, we have to make the dishwashers much more efficient. So they have to be able to get your dishes clean, and they can't use very much water. That's why, if you haven't noticed, it used to be the dishwasher might run for half an hour, 45 minutes, and it would get the dishes nice and clean. Now, I can tell you, because I load the family dishwasher, 3.5 hours is not unusual. If you put it on pots and pans, and it's 3.5 hours to wash all those dishes. And you say, why? Why does it take so long? Because they mandated that you've got to cut down on the use of water and energy and everything else to wash dishes. And now Joe Biden and his folks in the bureaucracy, not at the Congress, they're going to ask the bureaucrats to do this to you, which means you have almost nothing to say about it. And let me warn you about the scam that they're trying, because this literally involves, well, if you add up all the dishwashers that people buy every year, and you usually have to replace them every so often when they wear out, we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. But I'm going to warn you how they're going to scam you. Here's the way they sell the idea. The new Joe Biden dishwasher standards, which are not being passed by Congress, they're being adopted by bureaucrats who can't be fired, were not elected by you. You don't know who they are. You can't get rid of them. They do not answer to the public. They are in many ways, they are more powerful than a member of Congress. Because if a member of the House of Representatives, for example, has a stupid idea, they have to get at least 217 other U.S. members of Congress to get that idea through the House of Representatives. And then they need 51 senators to vote for it, assuming that they don't block it with filibuster and all that. And then it has to go to the president's desk. So you say, you mean I've got to get a majority of 535 people to agree with the idea, and I got to get the president to sign it? How much easier does the bureaucracy have in taking an idea? You say you got a couple of bureaucrats who like the idea, and they write it into the Federal Code of Regulations, and it has the force of law. And you say, hold on, that sounds a whole lot more powerful. And members of the House of Representatives, they have to run for re-election every 2 years, which means they're constantly, as soon as they're re-elected, they have to think about running for re-election again. A bureaucrat working within the federal bureaucracy, they don't have to run for re-election. Under the civil service laws, they are almost unfireable unless they commit some horrendous crime. You can't get rid of them. So what do these bureaucrat bozos do? They say the new dishwasher standards could save American households $168 million every year on utility bills, according to an estimate from the Department of Energy, which I would do away with tomorrow if I could, although I'd keep the part that deals with the nuclear weapons, because the DOE does deal with nuclear weapons. And you say $168 million, that sounds like a lot of money. Well, it is if it's all in one chunk. Like you win the lottery and you get $168 million, that would be tremendous. How much does it add up to for each American household? Well, that's easy. The number of American households in the United States is about 130 million. You say, hold on a second, Lars. You're telling me that these new dishwasher standards, which they sell by saying it's going to save American households of $168 million a year, is going to save my family $1.25 a year? $1.25? Not even enough to buy a cup of coffee in most parts of America right now. $1.25 per household per year. Wow. Don't spend it all in one place. But it gets worse than that. How much is it going to increase the cost of the new dishwasher you want to buy? Well, the Department of Energy, which I'm willing to bet is completely wrong and low on this number, says your new dishwasher is going to cost $15 more. And you say, well, if dishwashers cost $300, $400, $500, they can cost $1,000 depending on what you're buying. But if it's only $15, not a big deal. But let me take the Department of Energy's word for it, that we really will save $1.25 per household per year, about 10 cents a month. And the new dishwasher is only going to cost $15 more. Let's see. Now do the math, because I like doing math like this. How many years, if I have to pay $15 extra for that dishwasher, how many years is it going to take for the savings in electricity to pay back the extra $15. As I said, I think the number is going to be much higher, but say it's $15 more is all you have to pay. And you're saving $1.25. Now, let's not count interest into this, because if you did, it makes it even worse. It's going to take you 12 years to save back the extra cost of the dishwasher. And you say, Lars, that's not a very good deal. No, it's not a very good deal at all. You save $1.25, not a month, not a week, $1.25 a year, and you're going to pay $15 more for the dishwasher, assuming it's not $20 or $30 or $40 more, because I think when they finally get done with this, it'll be much higher than that. And then ask yourself this: did your last dishwasher last for 12 years? Because that's the break-even point where you actually get back the extra money you put in. And then when the Department of Energy's big, huge savings of $168 million a year, or $1.25 for every household in America, payoff point in 12 years, if your dishwasher lasts that long, and all of that for what is likely to be a dishwasher that ain't going to get your dishes nearly as clean. It'll probably take longer to run, be less convenient for Americans, and this is the most important thing for Americans: not stopping fentanyl from coming in from China through Mexico, not stopping violent crime in big cities. Joe Biden wants to save you $1.25 a year, or about 10 cents a month. 10 cents a month is what he's going to save you, and it's only going to cost you more than that. If that makes sense to any of you, I would be glad to hear your objections as a naysayer at 866-HEY-LARS. Hey, Lars, that's 868. It just gets me choked up just thinking about my fine dishwasher. Coming up in a moment, a few years back, Ukraine's government decided to take guns away from its citizens, and now, of course, they would have come in a bit handy. But how much of a difference would leaving Ukrainians armed have made? We're going to talk about that coming up in a moment as we consider the disarming of American citizens that Joe Biden wants to get about. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's not an argument that I use very often, but, we lost our guy. But we'll get to that in a moment. But this is not an argument that I use all the time. I tell people that I prize my Second Amendment rights. And of course, the first reason for having Second Amendment rights is to make sure that if Americans ever face a tyrannical government, and we've certainly come very, very close, if not going over the line in the last couple of years of the pandemic, if we ever face a tyrannical government, that having an armed citizenry is a great guide or a great guard against a tyrannical government. Because if the government knows that citizens are capable of coming after the government if necessary, then they tend to be on their best behavior. But we've also considered the notion that if America were ever attacked physically, I think we have to go back to World War II, where I think it was Tojo or was it Yamamoto, Mark, who said, I fear that we have awakened a sleeping giant and that behind every blade of grass will be an American armed with a gun, or words to that effect. Welcome back, Mark, by the way.
That's right. That's right, Lars. That's exactly right. And, remember, it's not just about winning the war when someone is invading you. They have to occupy the country. That's why when, President Biden talks about, you got to deter tyranny from a nuclear power, you need to have nuclear weapons. But no, because the founding fathers specifically write about this, including early Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, talks about that the critical benefit of having armed citizens, of which there are many, is that you prevent invading forces, even if they're successful initially, from being able to occupy you, because you're eventually going to be able to force them out. Now, of course, when I write about this in Disarmed, Lars, I specifically say that Americans can learn from the mistakes that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainians made, because they contemplated adopting a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms back in 2013, and they chose not to. And, of course, the Russians invade, and now guess what? They're scrambling to try to get small arms from the United States to fight back.
And in fact, they were doing exactly that. I remember early on in Ukraine that we were watching the government literally hand out weapons to citizens, something I'm reasonably sure the Biden administration would not do unless it were in dire straits. But the book is called Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. And that's where you've focused, isn't it?
That's right, because there's many books and articles written about the importance, Lars, of you and I being able to defend ourselves against individual criminals and street crime and people that break into our home in the middle of the night. But what I wanted to talk about is use the Ukraine experience in a real-time, real-life example and say, what lessons can we as American gun owners and supporters of the Second Amendment learn from the Ukrainian experience? And one of the critical things, of course, is that the Ukrainians at one point were one of the largest militaries in the world. When the Soviet Union fell, not only did the Ukrainians have massive stockpiles of small arms, AK-47s, and small arm ammunition, they even had nuclear weapons. And it was the American left, specifically Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, that basically stepped into the breach and encouraged. This is on the record. I talk about this in my book, Lars, Disarmed. They literally encouraged the Ukrainians to disarm, give up their nuclear weapons, give up their small arms stockpiles, and become dependent upon the United States and others for their protection. And of course, this process of disarmament was a terrible idea, as we see in hindsight. And I want American gun owners to learn the mistakes and the responses of the Ukrainians so we don't make that same terrible mistake here in the United States, which I don't think we will, because the founding fathers are wise. They gave us the Second Amendment, and I don't think we'll be giving that up anytime soon.
No, I don't think so either. And the thing is, history seems to be full of lots of examples. I mean, when the United States rolled into Vietnam in the 60s in force, because we had advisors there even all the way back to Truman, you'd say, well, we have the superior technology, intelligence, aircraft, and everything else. This will be a cakewalk. No, not quite. And it wasn't. And I remember reading John Paul Van's book, A Bright Shining Lie. I don't agree with everything he writes, but he pointed out sometimes the technology actually works against you when you try to occupy an area, and the local population still has old World War II Garands, and you say, well, that can't beat our technology. Well, try it on for size and see how it works.
That's right. And one of the things I write about in my book, Disarmed, is the famous Revolutionary War hero, John Stark, who was the hero of Bunker Hill and Bennington. And he literally writes this at the early part of our country after we had won the revolution. He specifically says that the astonishing success of the Americans taught that the enemies of liberty, that in other words, you'd rather be undisciplined freemen rather than enemies of liberty, because the supporters of free men and of freedom have something to fight for. And even if they have small arms and they're not as well equipped as, the slaves of the empires, is basically what he said, you should always count that the freedmen can win this if they have some sort of arms. And of course, that's how we got the Second Amendment. It's just another check on tyrannical government. It's another check on tyranny in all of its forms, not just government, but other things too. And again, the Ukrainians learned this the hard way. And I like to say, Lars, it's much better to learn from the mistakes of others than from your own mistakes, which are very costly. Let's learn from the mistakes of the Ukrainians by disarming themselves and refusing to adopt a Second Amendment, which they had a chance to in 2013 and chose not to.
I'm talking to the constitutional attorney, Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner podcast and author of the new book, Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. Now, Mark, I've admitted my bias. I've owned guns since I was a little kid. I own them as an adult. I don't get to shoot them as often as I'd like to because I don't have time to get to the range as much as I'd like to. But have you been surprised by the seeming willingness of an awful lot of Americans to say, yeah, pass some laws, make it impossible to own guns? So many states have done that, including my home state of Washington.
Well, I think actually the anti-gun movement is in retreat. If you actually look at the map of the United States, Lars, carefully, what you see is the continued expansion. It's not the expansion. It's the restoration of the right to bear arms. We have a Supreme Court that is now enforcing the text of the Second Amendment in a robust way. And if you look at where the anti-gun movement has deployed their resources, it's in those states where they control the organs of government. They've retreated to New York. They've retreated to Oregon. They've retreated to Washington. They've retreated to California. They're no longer trying to make inroads in the so-called red states, because we now have in the red states 27 states that have permitless carry, where a law-abiding American can carry a gun just because they're Americans. We in the Second Amendment movement are on the march, and what you see is the anti-gun movement doubling down and tripling down in the few states they control. That is not an expansionist approach. They'd love to expand their anti-gun movements, but they can't. So they're going back to home base, and they're doing the best they can at home base, but that may not work because the Supreme Court may knock a lot of that stuff out.
Well, and by the way, Mark, even in the blue states, you mentioned Oregon, there is now approved for the ballot. They have to gather the signatures, a citizen initiative, which is allowed to make law that would allow constitutional carry the way the other 27 states have. I have a feeling that voters may work. You know, they tend to elect liberal nitwits to Congress and to public office. But when it comes down to the issues and voting on them, I think you're going to see citizens vote in favor of constitutional carry. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I want you to consider a question. Even in a conservative state like Texas, is it possible that those in public education, meaning those who draw their paychecks from the government entities we know of as the so-called public schools, I would prefer to call them government schools, is it possible that those people, while drawing a healthy check from the public treasury and purporting to educate your kids, sometimes they don't do quite that job either? Are they more interested in protecting your children or protecting yourself or themselves? I'm going to give you a specific example from Plainview, Texas. But before I do that, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you on board on a Monday. If you want to jump into what we call, and we live up to it, the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and I'll tell you about our Twitter poll a bit later. But here's the way it's being reported. A 6-year-old girl forced by another 6-year-old child, a boy, to go under his desk, and I hate to say this, but perform an unnamed sex act on him in the middle of class while the teacher was in the room and supposedly being distracted while teaching another student. Another little boy used a school-issued iPad to record the assault, and the school only found out when they discovered that the kids put an electronic lock on the iPad that forced the tech guys to hack back into it. According to the school, they notified Child Protective Services and the police, and since that's all that was required of them legally, they didn't bother to tell the parents. The parents would have never known, except their daughter began acting anxious and afraid. And they sat down and did what good parents do. They said, "What's bothering you?" Heather Gonzalez, an older cousin of the 6-year-old girl, told one of the local radio stations that the school district has not provided adequate answers. Everything was no comment, I can't tell you, no comment. As she put it, so you mean to tell me that abuse that's been happening for a week and a half and these kids are still sitting at the same desk? My cousin is still at the desk with all the boys having to see her abusers every day? The students have reportedly since been moved to separate classrooms. Now, this gets to the heart of what is going wrong with today's schools. The schools are more interested in protecting themselves, in protecting their own reputation, in meeting standards of political correctness or whatever. And if you're going to ask me, and somebody might say, Lars, and because I anticipate this, Lars, are you saying they should take a 6-year-old boy and put him in prison? No, I'm not suggesting that at all. In fact, in most states, if you force a girl to perform a sex act like that and has 2 children, the courts will take note of that. And in many cases, here's what happens. Not every state. I don't know the laws of every state, but in most states, there are 2 things they can do with a juvenile criminal, whether the juvenile is 6 or 16. You can find that you have been delinquent. That is the adult equivalent of being found guilty of a crime. Except I don't think there's a single state in America that finds children guilty. But they can find them to be delinquent, which is the juvenile equivalent of guilty. Well, what's the other possibility? The other possibility is dependent. If a court says, we're going to find that this child is dependent, what it means is the court's going to say, this child, the 6-year-old boy and his friend who forced that girl to perform a sex act and then videoed it, there's no indication that it got onto the internet because, as we all know, if a picture or a video gets on the internet, you will never, ever get rid of it altogether. It'll live on the internet forever. and this will follow that girl for the rest of her life. Thank God there's no indication that this video or the pictures made their way to the internet. But what you could do if the school wasn't concerned about protecting its own reputation in the community, they could call the police. The police would refer the case of the 2 6-year-olds to a juvenile court judge. You could then say, the judge could say, I'm not going to find you delinquent. I'm not going to find you guilty of a crime. You're a child below the age of 12. Most prosecutors will tell you you don't have the mental capacity under the age of 12 to form what's called criminal intent. Above 12, it's an open question. Above 18, you're an adult. Everything applies. But if a judge were to find that these 2 6-year-old boys, because of their behavior, which is assaultive behavior, it is criminal behavior if they did it as young men. So the judge could find them under his or her jurisdiction, under the jurisdiction of the judge, and could say, I want the parents to seek help for these kids. I want them to have their behavior corrected. And the judge could tell the parents, you either get this done for your kids and you get them some counseling, you get them some behavior modification, whatever it happens to be. You can't have 6-year-olds who grow up thinking we can commit a sexual crime against another child and get away with it. And that behavior has to change. A judge could order the parents to do that. And if the parents fail to comply with the judge's order, contempt of court is always available. Now, do I want the law? Do I want the courts and the cops and everything else to be in people's lives? If the answer is for most things, the answer is no. But if the answer is to protect little 6-year-old girls, I mean, I've got a granddaughter who just turned 7. That's her age. If we're going to protect little girls and little boys from the kind of predators that are out there who are adults, we've got to catch that behavior early on. And I know to a fair certainty that what the Plainview South Elementary School is doing is they wanted to do the bare minimum. They wanted to report to CPS and nothing more. They wanted to leave the kids, the boys, right where they were. They did not want to call the parents on the carpet. They didn't even want to tell the parents of the little girl who was the victim of what would have been a sexual crime if it were committed by anybody but a 6-year-old. And they didn't want to do that. So you've got to make the schools be accountable to the parents. You've got to make the schools be accountable to the community. And you've got to have a judge take a look at that. If somebody has a better idea, I'd be glad to take a naysayer call on it. But if you can imagine, to say that a child, a 6-year-old boy, who's done something like that to a fellow child and nothing much happens, can you imagine what lesson he takes home from that? Let's go to Bob in Lansing, Michigan, listening on WILS. Hey, Bob, we're close to the break, but what's on your mind?
I just have a comment on the reparations and my take on it.
Yep.
I think if I owe the blacks anything, where would they be if their ancestors hadn't been slaves? I owe them a one-way ticket back to wherever they came. That's the only thing
I don't buy that argument, Bob, and I'll tell you why. If people were brought here against their will, they are now American citizens, and they are not the blacks. They are other American citizens. I want to look at this in a colorblind manner. They're American citizens. They were never slaves. Is there any reason today to tell other Americans you must pay because of your skin color to other people who were never slaves and you were never a slaveholder? But I don't look at it the way you do, but thank you for the call anyway. Back in just a moment, you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. Well, we're coming up on another election year next year, and of course, the odds are, based on the polls, Donald Trump will get the Republican nomination, and that's a good thing. Joe Biden will get what the Democrats have to offer. Not a good thing for the Democrats, but I don't care. I want them to lose. On that note, Sean Carney joins me now, CEO and president of 40 Days for Life. Sean, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
So I'm expecting it to be a matchup between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and I'm expecting Donald Trump to mop the floor with Joe Biden. But one of the issues out there, which has played both directions, I think, for both parties, is that of abortion. I'm pro-life. I'd like to see all this play out because the Supreme Court finally came to its senses and decided there is no right to abortion in the Constitution, which anybody who's read it understands. How much of an impact is the issue going to have on next year's presidential race?
I think it'll be huge because Biden has really nothing to run on except they want to lock women up and Trump is evil, which worked, unfortunately. So I would hope that he would mop the floor with him, but I said that 4 years ago or in 2020 and it didn't happen. So it's going to be very, very key. Of course, I don't think it works out well for Biden because the pro-life issue is Trump's strength, his legacy. Whether we ever hear from him ever again will be those 3 Supreme Court justices, and all of his judicial appointments for that matter. So it's really it's a strength for Trump. He can defend his pro-life stance. He did a great job in 2016 running against Hillary doing that, and But I agree. I think that I think that it is going to be a significant part of 2024.
Well, I think it is too, and I might disagree with you. I don't think that Joe Biden actually won in 2020, but that's a discussion for another day because of cheating. And I think they'll try to cheat, but a lot of states have adopted new rules and new restrictions to try to at least slow down the cheating, if nothing else. But I've told people before, I wish people could remember that if you went back to the summer of 2015 when he came down the escalator, and that fall when I personally decided about just before Christmas time, I thought, this is the guy. If I had told people then, 5 years from now, you're going to say Donald Trump is the biggest pro-life candidate that America has ever seen, even better than Reagan, people would have called me crazy. The fact is that's exactly what he was the best pro-life candidate in modern American presidential history, and that's a good thing. And I just don't see how the Democrats managed to win on this one.
I don't either, but they did, and that whether there was election fraud or not, they did that in 2020, and I think that's the great fear. I hope you're right. I hope these states have fixed things. I hope we don't have the drama that we had with 2020. Trump on the ticket was a motivator for Democrats to go out and basically vote for a guy who said, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to say anything. And I'm just going to let the other guy get all the attention, and I'll take my bet doing that. The other thing is it's just going to be interesting to see what happens in the primary. That's one of the things that, obviously DeSantis will run. I'm sure a few others will run. They'll have to spend a lot of money beating each other up and then come to the conclusion. I think Trump wins the primary. But I don't think it's a shoo-in that he wins the general election. He comes with a lot of baggage for most people, particularly independents, and it's a risk. It's a big risk. And so I think the primaries will bring out a lot of good and bad that Democrats can use. But a lot of that, as you mentioned, will be surrounding the abortion issue, and I just think that's a tremendous strength for Trump.
It's just, I wonder if Republicans make mistakes in how they present this issue, because for me, it's very clear cut.
Yeah.
You're going to run as president, Joe Biden, on the strength of your willingness to let babies the lives of babies be extinguished for any kind of matter of convenience, because people always drop back to, well, what about rape and incest and save the life of the mother, which the best numbers out of Florida, who's the only state that actually captures this information from people seeking abortions, is 2 or 3% of the number. And that's it. The other 97% are largely, and I don't think people like to talk about it, including Republicans, but it's largely convenience. And what I mean by that is a young lady says, I'm pregnant, it's going to be economically tough, so the baby dies. Or I'm pregnant by my last boyfriend, I now have a new boyfriend, and having a baby in me from the last boyfriend is not very, conducive to our new relationship, so for convenience, I'll get rid of the baby. And those always seemed like really tremendously bad reasons, to say, so I'll take a life. They're not to life. They're not to save the life of the mother. They're not rape and incest. And I've already talked to so many women who were the product of a rape or incest, and they're great Americans and usually very conservative because their mom didn't decide to just toss them because something bad happened. The baby did nothing wrong. And I think those are heart issues that Republicans might do well to actually embrace.
You're absolutely right. They should not run from those issues. They shouldn't run from the rape circumstances. You also have to talk to women who were raped and had an abortion, and the women who were raped and they chose life. Most of them give their baby up for adoption. But the idea that the left has created this myth that somehow abortion heals you from a rape is absurd. And we work with a lot of rape victims, and there are great ways to articulate it in compassionate ways. And it is typically nationwide less than 1%, but it matters to that 1%, and we have to address it. One of my good friends growing up was a product of rape, and his mom was raped at 14, and he always said, like, is my life less valuable because of how I was conceived? And so, I think that it's a strong thing that Republicans could win on, that most of them are ill-equipped. And when you look at these staunch pro-life politicians who own it, they did mop the floor in 2022. When you look at Greg Abbott, where I live in Texas, DeSantis, Kemp, these guys did great, and they didn't shy away or apologize for the Supreme Court dragging our nation out of 1973 science. And I think that needs to be said. I think that they need to create the big picture of, there's a lot of people sprinting on the wrong side of history. They didn't just overturn Roe. They beat it to death with a baseball bat. And the reaction from so many Democrats was, well, clearly now we need infanticide and we need to deregulate abortion pills. It's absurd, and history will be a harsh judge. And so I have no issue with Republicans or anybody taking a big picture approach and saying, this isn't going to age well. Okay, we can't do surgeries on unborn children. This guy in New York just did brain surgery on an unborn child. You can't prevent women from going on roller coasters because they're pregnant. You can't put Scott Peterson on death row for second-degree murder of his unborn child, Connor. Can't do all those things and then say, at 40 weeks, if your baby girl survives the abortion, we'll leave her there to suffocate.
No, this is crazy. And the other one I'd add to that, Sean, I had a buddy in high school whose little sister, Daisy, was Down syndrome. And wonderful little girl.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, and I ask people, I say, do you know what happens to most Down syndrome pregnancies? And people will say, no, I don't, because I used to work in TV news. TV news won't touch that story with a 10-foot pole. But imagine the outrage. We can all look back to the horrors of Dr. Mengele and say, what would you say about a society that decided to eliminate almost every one of the Down syndrome babies before they ever came out of mom? And you say, well, what happens to them? I said, 90+% get aborted. And you say, because they're Down syndrome? Yep. Well, that's kind of a monstrous idea, isn't it? That you'd say, this one isn't perfect. This one isn't, this one has Downs. So we'll simply kill it before it's born. And you say, well, that's outrageous. And I said, well, that is what's happening. Iceland brags about it. America is almost to the Iceland, demarcation line. And we don't want to be there. I think most people are ashamed to even admit that our country would do that. That's Sean Carney, the CEO and president of 40 Days for Life. We'll be back in a moment, and we'll talk about the Democrats and gender-affirming care, so-called. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'll get to John Kerry and his behavior at the royal coronation, which I can guarantee you I spent exactly 0 time watching or 0 time paying attention to this past weekend, but there was something I needed to take note of when it comes to John Kerry. Let me get to that in just a moment. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your phone calls and your emails. If you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you're a naysayer, I put you right to the head of the line. If you believe something I've said, gets you all crossed up, go ahead, call the show. Tell me why. Be a naysayer, and I'll be glad to ask you a few questions in aid of an objection, as the lawyers like to say in court. Let me tell you first, though, the Post-Millennial is reporting on something very interesting when it comes to what the mainstream media and most of the politicians who push this kind of nonsense, they call it gender-affirming care for minors. Now, it may be that's their euphemism. You can always tell when somebody's doing something they're not particularly proud of when they use a euphemism for it instead of actually calling it what it is. What it is giving puberty blockers and chemically castrating children. It is giving double mastectomies to teenage girls and chemically castrating young boys, and they want to call it gender affirming care because the actual truth is too ugly. Well, here's what the postmillennial, our friends Andy Ngo and Ari Hoffman and others point out. A 2021 study of military youth has revealed that not only were minors with severe mental illness allowed to embark upon experimental medical sex changes, but also that prescriptions for antipsychotic drugs actually increased after hormone interventions were initiated. The study, published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, examined the Department of Defense records for 3,754 trans-identified adolescents and about 6,600 siblings who did not identify as transgender. The findings reveal no improvement in mental health after the start of the hormone intervention and an increase in prescriptions for psychotropic medication. Now, do you know why this is important? Let me give you my translation. You are told today that if society does not embrace and endorse transgenderism, that is, when a child comes to you as a child, 12 years old, 10 years old, they're now actually talking about transgender treatment for toddlers. If that child tells you, I was born in a boy's body, I believe I'm a girl, or vice versa, that if you don't accommodate that desire, and not just accommodate it, actually endorse it by saying, well, we'll get you treatment, including puberty blockers and all the rest, that child might just commit suicide. The findings reveal no improvement of mental health after the start of hormone interventions, and it actually shows an increase in prescriptions for psychotropic medication. One of the co-authors of the study, Dr. David Klein of the David Grant Medical Center at Travis Air Force Base, believes that these pre-existing serious mental health issues could just melt away after adolescents underwent sex change intervention. Speaking to the Urology Times, a professional journal, he explained that at first glance, it appears from looking at the study that transgender people are more likely to suffer from psychotic conditions like schizophrenia. But he says that maybe antipsychotic drugs were being prescribed as adjuncts to severe depression or insomnia as opposed to a primary psychotic condition. The point is that if you're told these are kids who are troubled by who they are, and if we simply endorse and then help them change from boy to girl or girl to boy, that we can solve their problems. It appears it doesn't solve their problems. I gave you a set of studies last week that were done that actually said when we've done this, and especially in Europe, which tends to track a little bit ahead on this kind of nonsense of the United States, they found that up to 30% of the people who made the transition, boy to girl or girl to boy, later regretted it and said, put me back the way I was before. It doesn't help. It also doesn't necessarily help with suicide. That suicides in post-transition transgender are high, and in some cases even higher than for kids who never went through it. Now, if that makes you believe that maybe we're making a colossal mistake, that this is going to turn into a disaster, that you're going to endorse all these kids doing it, they'll get a lot of attention as a result of having done it, and it may not solve their suicide problem. Of course, proving what would not have happened instead of what did happen is going to be extraordinarily difficult. Second, does America have the capacity to produce enough solar panels to meet demand pushed by Joe Biden? That's the promise from Joe Biden. And the Washington Free Beacon wrote about it. Let me remind you that Joe Biden says we're going to transform this country so fast. He literally promised about a week ago that all military vehicles will be climate friendly by 2030, 6.5 years from now. Now, I find that absolutely absurd, and so do a lot of other people, because they say, hold on, you're going to transform every single vehicle used by the United States military to run on electric power or something other than gasoline, diesel, or natural gas. Well, the problem is we don't have the capacity to do it. Free Beacon reports it this way. Shortly after Joe Biden offered tax credits to anybody buying solar panels, a Colorado homeowner named Stacy took out loans to install $30,000 worth of panels on her roof. 6 months later, though, the panels sat unused. They were generating no power. The problem seemed to have a simple fix. Stacy's energy provider simply needed to hook the panels up to the power grid, but there's no room on the grid. Stacy's predicament reflects a significant snag in Joe Biden's green energy revolution. While hundreds of billions of dollars in green energy spending has been allocated through the badly named, I think actually it's a lie when they called it the Inflation Reduction Act, to fund wind and solar, America's antiquated power grid is not ready to accommodate them. It'd be like having automobiles and no roads. Nearly 1,300 gigawatts worth, or gigawatts if you called it the way they did in Back to the Future, 1,300 gigawatts worth of green energy is still waiting to be connected to power. The country's entire electric grid has an installed capacity of just 1,250 gigawatts. So you're buying the devices and say this is the future, and you don't have the wires to connect it. Just consider that for just a moment. Now, from our email, this one comes from a guy who signs himself Billy B. Billy. Lars, I thought of a great idea for the 87,000 tax agents that Bozo Joe has hired. Send them all to the border and have the illegals sign up to pay taxes as they come in. What do you think? Signed, Billy. By the way, have a great week. I'm glad for that. Your good wishes. 87,000 tax agents signing up illegal aliens so that they can go ahead and pay taxes right away. I don't want them paying taxes. If they came into my country illegally, I don't want them here. I want them to come in legally and lawfully. Immigrants who come into this country legally and lawfully, I would welcome them from no matter where they come from on planet Earth. Come here illegally, I don't care if you came in with pockets lined with gold, you're not welcome in this country. Oh, and by the way, this one comes from Not the Bee. Here's another reason to deadbolt your hotel door. Peter Brennan was sleeping soundly in his room in downtown Nashville when he woke up to a man sucking his toes. According to Brennan and the police, the man was 52-year-old David Neal, the manager of the hotel. Of course, police have charged Neal with aggravated burglary and assault. And I want to mention this as well. This is a number to help understand what's going on our southern border right now, and it's only getting worse. Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz last Saturday, just a couple of days ago, said there were 55,000 illegal alien apprehensions, almost 19,000 gotaways at the southern border in a single week. That gives you an idea of the scope and the size of that problem. Coming up in a moment, first it was the lights in your house and then your car, and now Joe Biden is planning to turn your mortgage into another tool to push his woke agenda. We'll get to that coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. This one really hits me where I live because my wife and I have been fortunate enough to be able to buy a house, and we're glad to do that. The problem is Joe Biden wants to turn your home mortgage into a tool of the woke agenda. And to get a full description of this and ask a few questions of things I'd like to know in the details, Roger Valdez joins me now, who's director of the Center for Housing Economics and a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Roger, welcome back.
Oh, hi. Thanks. It's nice talking to you, Lars.
Nice to talk to you as well. What is it that Joe Biden is proposing? Because I've characterized it to my audience, but I want to make sure I'm accurate. What's he doing?
Well, that headline you're probably looking at the headline in the Fox opinion piece that I wrote, probably overstates it a little bit. But I think what we're seeing is an effort to try and address a real disparity between home ownership among some populations and some others, particularly white and black households. And there is a real disparity there. About 72% of white households own their home or are paying a mortgage, and only about 44% of black households are. And the problem is that a lot of groups and the governments, local governments especially, are going after things like credit scores, criminal background checks, previous evictions or previous history for tenants that are trying to sign a lease. And all of these things cumulatively are going to impact the ability of developers, builders, housing providers to be able to serve people that have less money. So it's going to have the opposite effect. And so what I was calling out in that post was the credit thing, where they're trying to charge higher fees for people with higher credit. In Minneapolis, getting rid of credit scores for people that want to rent housing, getting rid of criminal background checks in Washington State, and then getting rid of the previous, tenancy history. All of that is in an effort to try to address this disparity or the disparity within populations. But it's really just going to make it more difficult to own and operate housing, which will have an inflationary effect across the housing economy.
I mean, because Roger, decades ago, I owned a little duplex and I rented. So I got an experience of 10 years as a landlord. So I know exactly what it's like. I had great tenants sometimes. I had some lousy tenants sometimes. But you want to have good tenants because you want people who take care of the place and pay the bills. That's what the landlord cares about. And if you have, I didn't own a big multifamily, but if you have a big, say an apartment complex of 10 units and you've got one tenant who's obnoxious and bothers the other tenants, you end up losing your good tenants in favor of bad tenants, tenants who don't behave reasonably toward others, tenants who don't pay the rent. And I think that's a colorblind problem. You can get problematic. In fact, one of my best tenants was a guy who was black, and he was my tenant for 10 years, and we got along famously. I had other tenants who weren't as dependable, and most of them were white. So my experience was, committing crimes is not something that has to do with your skin color. Although demographically, as a percentage-wise, there are an awful lot of black Americans who are involved in criminal activity. Those are the numbers, and you can't do anything about it. But credit, paying your bills on time.
You can, though. You
what
can
do you do?
if you can address generational poverty, and that's the whole idea behind getting people to become homeowners, because you can generate that equity in that home, and then when you sell it, you can generate wealth, or when you die, you can leave it to your kids, right? And so that's a real opportunity. But the best way to do that is not to get rid of credit scores or play with them unfairly, but it's to help people improve their credit scores, including things like rental payments. So the rental and the owner thing kind of come together, because if you're a good renter, you should get credit for that. That should help you leverage yourself eventually into home ownership, and then as you get older, you can pass that on to your kids, or you can, use that as an economic opportunity. And that's really what we advocate for is, let's not get rid of the score. Let's try to improve the scores and try to expand the playing field for people that are black or have criminal backgrounds or whatever it is. People that really want to try to solve that problem should get credit for it and get that opportunity. But, taking away the score altogether is not going to, take away the fact that they're not earning enough money or they have the background that they have. So we're just saying make it, provide the opportunity, help people, give them a chance if they want to work through the problems that they have so that they can become homeowners. But putting your finger on the scale like that is not going to help them or other people that are out there trying to own a home.
Well, see, I'd agree with you. Roger, is there a good structural reason why the credit companies that seem to track every other thing you do when it comes to money and how you pay your bills, why don't they track rental history?
It's a good question. I mean, I've had very little luck with the credit bureaus trying to address this issue with them. And I think it's because they've just got their system and it's proprietary, and they really don't, they don't want, it's competitive, and they really don't want to share that information. And I think that it's going to come and bite them now, because a lot of the, as you described, sort of the woke activist crowd is going to come after credit scores. And I warned them a while back, the trade association, it's really time to work on pilot projects to expand that playing field, include other data. And they just seem disinterested. And so I think the chickens are coming home to roost now, because people are getting frustrated and angry that they're not getting credit for what they feel they've accomplished, and they're still getting held back. And, that's going to affect the ability of the credit agencies to sell their service. So, companies like the one I think I mentioned last time, Pinata, is a for-profit company that's out there trying to work with housing providers to track rental payment. And then I've even heard of some landlords, housing providers, offering like a voucher or a coupon that you can cash after 6 months of rental payments made ahead of time. So 5 days ahead or something like that, they'll give you a $50, cash bonus or something. So people are innovating and trying to figure out, okay, how do we help people that are doing the right thing? But just, getting rid of the credit score or hiding bad tenants history, that's not going to help anybody because it doesn't solve the underlying problem, right? So that's really what we're after.
Well, and see, I could see a landlord when I was a landlord, and that was, again, decades ago. I'd have loved to have been able to say, I'd like to talk to potential tenants who have a solid record of paying their rent on time. And if there were a service that allowed that, the problem is it would also have to identify those who didn't pay their rent on time. And would I use that information? Absolutely, I would. And I have a feeling the woke folks would say, oh, no, you can only use the positive stuff. You can never use the negative stuff. That's Roger Valdez. Roger, thank you. Research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. So another crazy guy with a gun, but it's the crazy guy who did the deed in Texas over the weekend, and people end up dead because of it. And, of course, the mainstream media with 8 people dead, at least 7 others wounded in Texas when he opened fire in Allen, Texas at an outlet mall. Of course, they got to find some kind of meme to attach this to. And the person is Hispanic, so they say, well, he must have been a white supremacist. Let me get into that in just a minute and what the details are we know about what happened this weekend and what I think that the mainstream media is probably going to put this one in the rearview mirror about as fast as they possibly can. First, welcome to a Monday on the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you with me. And if you want to jump into our conversation, the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails, and we made that easy to remember too, talk@larslarson.com. And of course, you can always vote in our Twitter poll. We actually post at 2 different places. Still called the Twitter poll. Yes, we survived the bad years, and now the Elon Musk reforms at Twitter. You'll find it at Lars Larson Show, and also on our website. If you don't want to go to Twitter, just go to larslarson.com. The vote counts the same. But let me tell you a bit about Mauricio Garcia, 33 years old, of Dallas. Fact is, he walked into this mall, and for reasons that the authorities still have not entirely figured out, although I think they're going to figure out, the guy was just crazy. Now, what'd they find out? He shoots for no apparent reason. People ran. 8 people were killed. 7 people were wounded. And then, as usual, the thing that stops a bad guy with a gun was a good guy with a gun. An off-duty cop who happened to be either at the mall or nearby, who immediately went, and while calling for help, he actually in the 911 call says, send everyone. And I understand the situation. When you've got 8 people on the ground dead, you've got 7 people who are wounded, and you've got a guy with a gun, but that officer took him on. He was, of course, carrying off-duty, which is what most police are encouraged to do, and he managed to neutralize the threat, which is what we expect from police. So we've got a crazy guy. Now, why would I say he's crazy? Well, he went into the military about 15 years ago. He didn't even finish out basic training for the Army. They released him, and we're probably never going to know the true specifics of that, but he was released for either mental or physical problems or both, or one or the other. And he was released from the Army, never completed his basic training, never was assigned to anything, and he was sent on his way. Now, that was 15 years ago, so the fact is, we don't know what he was like 15 years ago. We know the Army said, you're not going to be able to even complete your basic training, and we don't know what his motivation may have been that would have driven him to do something like this. But the videos that have already been released, he apparently just stepped out of his car and immediately began shooting people, and people began running. And as I said, there was heroic action by an off-duty cop who was at the mall, heard the gunfire, and as always with public safety, ran in the direction of gunfire and killed Mr. Garcia. Thank God. it might have been much worse. And of course, already the mainstream media is reporting it this way. The 200th mass shooting this year. Yeah, there are organizations out there that are dead set on telling Americans you're not going to be able to own guns. And they want to take away the Second Amendment. And I'm not kidding. Joe Biden wants to do it. Many of the Democrat liberals want to do it, most of them, and an awful lot of private groups that try to make the argument that somehow if you disarm all the law-abiding citizens in the country, which means only the bad guys will have guns, that somehow you're going to solve the problem. They always talk about this as gun violence, as though a person never has anything to do with it. It's only the gun that is violent. Let me tell you a couple of factoids because I want to give you good information that you can actually act on. Fact number one, of all the violent crime in America, now if you don't know what that is, violent crime is rape, robbery, murder, assault, all of those kinds of crimes, 92% of it is committed without any use of a gun. Only 8% of violent crime in America involves a gun. 92% is without a gun. So even if you thought that if you could, by taking away the right of Americans to own guns at all, and you stripped every single gun out of the hand of every single law-abiding citizen in America, that you'd still have solved 8% of the crimes. The other 92% of violent crime would still be going on. And I'd be the first to agree with you. If you say America has a gigantic problem with violent crime, I agree. And 8% of it involves guns and 92% does not. And if you want to know the source of that information, it's the Crime Prevention Research Center. I can send you right to the website. It's not hard at all to find. So when your liberal friends talk about gun violence, we got to solve gun violence, you want to have some fun with them? Just turn to one of these liberal nitwits that says that to you and say, oh, well, that might address 8% of the crime in America. What do you want to do about the other 92%? And when they look at you like a deer caught in the headlights and you say, I don't understand what you mean. You say, well, 8% of the violent crime involves guns, 92% does not. Now, they're already casting Mauricio Garcia as a white supremacist because he visited different websites, because he said things online, except he's a person of color himself. Now, the distinction for most mainstream media, just so you know ahead of time, is that Mauricio Garcia is Hispanic, and Hispanic is not a race. It's an ethnicity. Like that makes any difference to people who are dead on the ground. Let me focus instead on the things that are actually relevant to what happened over the weekend in Allen, Texas. Number one, I'd like to know, usually there are three things that will disqualify you from buying a gun. Number one is if you're a convicted felon. Number two is a domestic violence accusation or domestic violence conviction. And that can even include, a fist fight with your brother where the cops are called. You get cited for that, you may lose your Second Amendment rights altogether. But the third reason is if a judge has said, I'm going to send you to some kind of mental health care, and I'm the court, I'm ordering you to go to some kind of mental health treatment or be locked up or otherwise your freedom taken away so your mental health issues can be addressed. In that case, you can't buy a gun. Here's what I'd like to know. When you fill out that Form 4473, the federal form to buy a gun, it applies in every state in America. It asks you whether or not you've ever been ordered for mental health treatment. Would that also include the U.S. Army when they say you've got a mental health problem, you're not going to be able to finish out basic training? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to see if I can find it for you. In the meantime, if you want to sound off, and we always put naysayers to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can always vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Coming up, a little commentary in the Northwest Nonsense on the Radio Northwest Network about all the corruption that has just been uncovered in the last couple of weeks in the state of Oregon. We'll get that next on the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. We have a massive mess on our southern border right now. It was caused by Joe Biden, in my estimation, because we had a largely under control border as Donald Trump left the White House, Joe Biden had campaigned on the idea of letting everybody cross in illegally. The number that I know from members of Congress is that in the last 2 and not quite 2.5 years, about 9 million people have illegally crossed into America. That is likely to be a record that we will never see eclipsed by somebody other than Joe Biden, although the next 2 years or a little less than 2 years of Joe Biden might actually be an even bigger number than the 9 million that have happened already. So what do we need to do to fix this problem? I invited Laura Reese on, who's a senior research fellow for Homeland Security at the Heritage Foundation and former acting deputy chief of staff for the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Reese, welcome back.
Thank you for having me on.
So what is the solution? And could Congress get a handle on this, even though the current commander-in-chief doesn't want to get a handle on it?
So the Congress needs to take back control over this issue and close some loopholes that this administration is exploiting, which includes asylum fraud. We had, during the last administration, used a brand new tool called Remain in Mexico, which said if you come to our border and say a few words of fear, we're not just going to release you into the U.S. where you'll disappear and then never even show up if you apply it for asylum at all, but you can wait in Mexico while your proceedings run its course. That, in conjunction with having agreements with governments of Central America that says, we'll help you build up your respective asylum systems, but if someone goes through your country, doesn't apply for asylum, and comes to the U.S. and claims asylum, we're going to send them back to your country. Because asylum is about saving lives. And if someone is truly fleeing for their life, they should ask for protection in the first safe country in which they enter, not forum shop or country shop and traverse multiple countries to get to the U.S. Those are some key aspects.
Yeah, and Laura, let me ask you, just so people are clear on this, when you say if you're leaving your country, if you're fleeing for your life, seeking asylum, not only should you stop in in the first safe country you arrive at that's willing to let you stay, that's international and U.S. law, isn't it?
It is. Many countries, most countries, have signed on to the asylum protocols, and that is part of that agreement. And so, but, you know, for many decades, the U.S. has been one of just a handful of countries that have taken in most of the refugees in the world for resettlement. And really, we need other countries to step up and to also resettle legitimate refugees. Now, we're not talking economic migrants, which many of these people are, and they admit as much. But they know that they can easily defraud our asylum system and come into the U.S., and that's what needs to be shut off.
I mean, because, Laura, one of the things that strikes me is that this is always cast as a problem of people seeking to save their own lives and escape persecution, which is very sympathetic. It's also cast as a problem of largely of families or women with small children. And yet I saw the report that I saw last night and another one this morning said almost everybody heading up to the border, as you and I are talking about this, are fighting age young males. They're not women, they're not children, they're not families. These are an entirely different crowd, and they want to come here out of the most base of motives, which is I want to make more money, which everybody can appreciate. All of us would like to make more money as long as we do it legally. But if you say, well, their desire to make more money, that should let them in. The law doesn't support that, does it?
No. And when it comes to asylum, obviously the U.S. has been extremely generous in taking in true refugees. But the left, unfortunately, uses it as an emotional weapon, and they've so watered down the standards to asylum just to grant more people to come in and stay in the U.S., and they've really rendered what I view as the second most important immigration benefit after U.S. citizenship. They've rendered asylum meaningless. And yet they know that people on the right won't criticize this because if you do, then, you know, the left calls you racist and everything else. And so the left has been successful at using this as an emotional tool to achieve their open border agenda, along with other things like unaccompanied alien children, using NGOs, including faith-based organizations, to process and transport many of these illegal aliens into and all over the country. They've been quite successful. So members on the right need to get the courage to call out the abuse of these tools and to end abuse of them.
I mean, Laura, I'm with you because over the decades, I haven't had much use for the Red Cross. A long time ago, I supported them. I gave them, pints of my blood and everything else and other donations. I don't any longer. But they're one of the agencies, an American organization, at least the American Red Cross, that's literally putting money in the hands of people who are trying to cross our border illegally. I almost think that I don't know that you could do it at the state level, but if a state prosecutor were to say you are aiding and abetting illegal aliens to cross that border, that's a crime, isn't it? If you aid and abet somebody to violate American immigration law?
It is. If you transport or harbor or, aid in that, support in that, then yes, that is considered smuggling. And the Biden administration in their most recent proposed asylum rule talked about how cartels guide aliens along the final miles of their journey and that is smuggling. And then just a few pages later, they talk about how they rely on NGOs to receive and help with their onward travel of migrants. Well, that also is smuggling. And so the left will say, well, if you can't go after these NGOs and the faith-based organizations, that's Catholic Charities, that's Lutheran Immigrant Refugee Services. That would be inhumane, and these groups are just helping vulnerable populations. Well, this is big money. They receive billions of dollars in federal grants to do this work. They've grown addicted to it, and now they're just trying to protect their funding.
Well, in fact, Laura, I'll make a comparison. I'm not asking you to join in this, but you remember the Holy Land Foundation, where we had people of faith, Muslims, who said there's a jihad going on overseas, and we're going to raise money to help that jihad. And they were convicted of the federal crime of raising money or giving assistance to terrorist activities. And you say, but that's part of their faith. Well, if faith-based groups here get involved in helping to traffic both children and adults across the border, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to say, well, for Christians it's okay, but for Muslims in a different kind of fight, it's not. It's all criminal activity for a reason.
Yeah, and we've called on Congress to defund these operations. And unfortunately, in the House bill, Secure the Border Act, which House is going to vote on this week, there is language that says no funding for these organizations doing this type of work. So now it's going to come down to the appropriators to actually defund. Meanwhile, Secretary Mayorkas of Homeland Security keeps moving money around, including FEMA money, to spend hundreds of millions of more dollars on this. And this is a fiscal bottomless pit. And he said publicly, even with this latest reprogramming request that he just made within the past few days, that won't be enough either. So truly, there's no end to this.
So it means, and I want people to think about this, the next time we've got an earthquake, a storm, a tornado, a hurricane, whatever in America, and FEMA says, well, we're short of cash to help out. They spent it on illegal aliens, and they did it at Joe Biden's bidding. Laura, thanks so much. That's Laura Reese from the Heritage Foundation, former acting deputy chief of staff for Homeland Security. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and emails, but I want to talk about the militarization of the IRS. Now, when I use that term militarization, a couple of years ago, there were people who were out marching in the streets, Antifa and BLM. They burned down big parts of American cities. They caused about $3 billion in damage. There were murders, there was looting, there was arson and everything else because they objected to what they called the militarization of the police. In other words, police that actually carry guns and have gear to protect them when they wade into a mob of people who have no right to do what they're doing. That's one thing. But when you militarize an agency that's supposed to be a bunch of guys and gals with green eye shades who are smart at numbers and they figure out what people owe or may owe beyond what they've paid, the IRS is supposed to simply be the government agency that makes sure that people pay the taxes that they owe. To arm them up with semi-automatic or even maybe fully automatic weapons and all this other military gear, you got to wonder what's going on. And the man who supplies the numbers for all that is our friend Adam Andrzejewski, CEO and founder of Open the Books. And of course, he wears as a badge of courage that he was fired as a columnist at Forbes magazine. Adam, welcome back.
Great to be on the program, Lars. Thanks for having me back.
Would you mind characterize for my audience just how bad the militarization of the IRS appears to be based on the numbers?
So here's the IRS gun locker before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the IRS owned 4,500 guns. That included over 600 shotguns, 500 AR-15 style rifles, and even 15 submachine guns. And this is what they've purchased after the pandemic. So after the pandemic, they spent $2.3 million on duty ammunition, $1.2 million on ballistic shields, plus another $1.3 million on various other gear for criminal investigative agents, which is a very non-transparent description. They spent another $500,000 on the Smith & Wesson AR-15 style rifles, $500,000 on duty tactical lighting, $500,000 on Beretta tactical shotguns. They have so much gear for their nearly 3,000 special agents that they spent $354,000 on bags, tactical gear bags for their special agents.
$350,000 just on the bags to carry the gear when they're in the field. I guess, Adam, the one thing the numbers don't describe, but I'm curious if you had some insights into this, is why does the agency need all this? And let me say in support of that question, I know that the IRS usually deals with boring stuff. You know, the taxpayer sends in his taxes, the IRS looks at the filing and says, nah, you left a bunch of stuff out, you owe some more. They send a notice to the taxpayer groans and says, okay, I owe some more. Or they talk to their tax person and they figure out how much more they owe or don't owe. And if necessary, you get an audit. And it's all very peaceful and all very copacetic. Then you've got a few people who may go almost militant and say, I'm not paying the IRS a dime, I'm a sovereign citizen or whatever. And they've said, okay, I'm just not going to pay. At some point, the IRS has to come and take your stuff, as they may be legally entitled to do. They put liens on your bank accounts. If you've got physical assets, they come to get them. I can imagine a few of those kinds of things, but there can't be that very many, are there?
Well, in that last situation, you've got 27 traditional federal law enforcement agencies that can be called. So what you're seeing here with the Internal Revenue Service and literally 75 other traditional regulatory, civil, general administrative agencies that are arming up, gunning up, what you're seeing is the blurring of the lines between those formally administrative agencies and those agencies having their own police power, their own law enforcement duties. And so you've got 27, like I said, traditional law enforcement agencies. Those people can be called. It's the U.S. Marshals. It's the FBI. You can split, and there's a real public purpose to split the duties between the administrative agencies and the law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, because, for example, Adam, I know that the DEA, which is a part of law enforcement, when they need assistance on a raid, so DEA is Drug Enforcement Administration, when they want to go out and do a drug raid, they find somebody who's trafficking fentanyl, and before it goes out and kills a bunch of people, the DEA won't stage a raid. When they need to do that, they oftentimes call the FBI or the marshals. They also call local law enforcement, the local sheriff, wherever this raid is going to happen, or the local police department if it's in a city. They have, even that agency calls on others to help them out when they say this could be a tough one or a dangerous one. We want some extra help, and they get that extra help. Why has the IRS in any way justified why they need all this extra armament?
So every single year since 2016, we broke this story, Lars, on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal back in 2016 with our then honorary chairman, the former legendary U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, Dr. Tom Coburn. I co-authored that piece with him. And every single year we go out for comment to the IRS. The last time they responded was 2021, and they said that their special agents have been using weapons throughout their history as they've consistently found themselves investigating the most dangerous criminals involved in organized crime, drugs, and gangs. And look, we don't want our law enforcement officials to be outgunned. What we're pointing out here is the blurring of the lines between the civil general enforcement agencies and traditional law enforcement agencies.
Well, and Adam, tell me this, because it came up not long ago. Do IRS agents have the power to arrest you?
Yes,
They
absolutely.
do.
Yes.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, within the 76 federal traditional administrative agencies, their inspector generals are not only do they have arrest and firearm authority, but they also have the ability to subpoena and to convene a grand jury. So we have really empowered these non-law enforcement agencies with a lot of power.
Well, and not only that, but if you say they can convene a grand jury, that means they can be the investigative agency, the arresting agency, and the prosecuting agency. And then their prosecutorial decisions are simply what? Backed up by the DOJ? Or do their lawyers go into court and actually prosecute people?
I think that the prosecution would lie elsewhere. But let's tease that out for a second, because
Sure.
the National Institutes of Health, you've got this Inspector General Corps, and they have all the powers that we're talking about. Okay, so at the height of the pandemic in March of 2020, Dr. Anthony Fauci was receiving death threats, and his safety was in jeopardy. And so traditionally, the U.S. Marshals would have handled his security detail. But the HHS Inspector General, the very people that were supposed to be holding Fauci accountable during the pandemic, they applied for special power through the U.S. Marshals to provide the security detail for Fauci. Fauci was actually being protected by the HHS IG, the Inspector General, the very people that were supposed to be holding him accountable.
That doesn't sound right. It sounds like you've crossed the lines and you've created a situation where is there any accountability at that point then?
Well, and that's what we've always said. Fauci was untouchable, unaccountable. He was unfireable. He was, over the course of his 50-some-year career, he had built quite an island for himself.
Where do we go from here? And is there anybody who can pull this back? Could the Congress say we're just not going to fund this?
Yes, as a matter of fact, when we highlighted this issue in 2016, the Trump administration, they identified this problem, and by 2017, on their reorganization of the federal government paperwork, in their plan, they had planned to strip those rank-and-file federal agencies of their arrest and firearm authority and transfer it back to the traditional law enforcement agencies. So right now, we're calling on Congress to hold hearings on the gun locker in these 76 agencies, and we'd like to testify.
Absolutely right. That's Adam Andrzejewski from Open the Books. Adam, thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Your calls are welcome. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.
Why do you think your polling is where it is?
Well, I don't think people, by the way, every major one who won re-election, their polling numbers were minor now.
Put polling aside then, right? Sentiment in this country, despite all these wins, is not very good.
I think all they've heard is negative news for 3 years. Everything is negative. And I'm not being critical of the press, but you turn on the television, the only way you're going to get a hit is if there's something negative. You don't, anyway.
That's Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who sits there in a network television interview and says, well, all I've had is negative coverage since the beginning of my presidency. Well, an awful lot of that negative coverage came because of negative decisions that Joe Biden himself made. I want to talk about that for a moment and where the polls put the presidential race of 2024 at this moment. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you happen to be a naysayer and you disagree with my point of view, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. We post that two different places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and larslarson.com on the web. Now, I'm really, in some ways, enjoying all of this because here's what I'm anticipating is going to happen next fall. Now, things could change a lot between the fall of 23, which is still 6 months away, and the fall of 24, which is 18 months away. But do you know what's going on right now? The major media has declared, just as they did in 2015 and 2016, there is no way in the world that Donald Trump is going to get the Republican nomination, except that all signs point toward Donald Trump doing exactly that. At the same time, They've got an American president who has failed over and over and over again. I could spend an hour describing the massive failures of Joe Biden. And most of those failures were self-imposed failures, self-imposed errors, where he decided to do things like shut down America's oil production as much as possible, like decide to pull out of Afghanistan precipitously, which led to the deaths of 13 service members. It led to a president making a promise to rescue Americans before all military troops were pulled out of Afghanistan. That didn't happen. Thousands are left behind. It involves inflation, which in the first summer of Joe Biden's presidency in 2020, he claimed that's just transitory. It'll go away in a while. Well, here it is, 2023, heading toward the middle of 2023, and inflation is still with us. So you've got massive errors made by Joe Biden. So when he's asked about this, say, you got these low poll numbers. He says, oh, all presidents have those low poll numbers. Well, if you believe, and Joe Biden apparently believes it, that he didn't get any kind of honeymoon, he got a massive honeymoon from the press, because the press decided we're going to largely stop fact-checking him. They had fact-checked Donald Trump to a fare thee well. Every single thing the man said was fact-checked and called out as a lie. Or you'd get stories that led off by saying, well, the president, without any factual basis for it, said X or Y or Z. Well, Joe Biden does that virtually every day. And then what happened this past weekend? On one of the Sunday shows, as they're referred to, an ABC News panel were kind of stunned because they talked about a brand new poll that was done for ABC News. And the poll found that if the matchup were held today between Joe Biden, who seems to be the odds-on favorite to have the Democrat nomination, it probably won't be Joe dropping out and Kamala Harris getting in instead. It almost certainly won't be Gavin Newsom from California. When voters were asked for a preference, 44% of adults said they would definitely or probably vote for Trump, and only 38% said they would vote for Joe Biden. Now, that was a survey done in the latter part of April, early part of May, so it was only a couple of weeks ago. And as ABC anchor George Stephanopoulos, who I'll remind you, worked for the Bill Clinton administration, he's a hardcore left-wing ideologue as far as I'm concerned, he says this poll is just brutal for President Biden. And that's a quote, by the way. The poll also found that 58% of voting age adults would prefer somebody else be the Democrat nominee, not Joe. And only 36% support Joe Biden getting the nomination. Most of the polls over the past year have found that most Democrats or Democrat-leaning voters would rather have a different presidential nominee. But they're not going to get it. The Democrats don't have a way to kick Joe Biden to the curb. And if they do, then they're going to have the prospect of Kamala Harris running and Gavin Newsom, and they're going to have to kick Kamala Harris to the curb as well. The potential matchup, when they do it in the poll and say, what if it was Biden versus Trump, and you throw in Ron DeSantis as well. Trump leads Biden 49-42. DeSantis tops the president, Biden that is, 48-41. So either one of the possible candidates, although I don't think Ron DeSantis is going to get the Republican nomination, I believe Donald Trump is going to get it, despite all predictions of the contrary. And I'm loving it that the mainstream media is ending up with egg all over its face because, of course, they've done everything they can to damn Donald Trump. They have said he caused the January 6th riot. No, not quite. He's committed all these crimes. No, not quite. They raided his house in Mar-a-Lago way back last August. And as soon as that raid happened, they said, that must mean they're about to indict him. Well, it's May. It's mid-May or near to mid-May of 2023. The raid happened in August. Where are all those criminal charges? Joe Biden trails Donald Trump by 9% among independent voters after leading by 13% in the 2020 election. Of course, that's if you believe the result of the polls back then. His lead among black voters, this is Joe Biden's lead, has also dropped from 75% to 35%. Even all of Joe's racial demagoguery, which is belied by his crazy comments about race, because the guy's been a racist since the beginning of his career in the U.S. Senate. An Emerson poll that was done back in February, here's what it found. Trump is the likely only Republican contender who can defeat Joe Biden. He leads 46 to 42. That was in the poll in February. So the gap between Trump and Biden is getting wider and wider. It's also estimated Biden would defeat DeSantis 44 to 40. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley 40 to 37. And one poll called the Premise Poll found that Trump had a huge lead, 47 to 41 over Joe Biden. DeSantis just barely beats Biden at 39 to 38. So watch the mainstream media. They're going to continue to say, well, Donald Trump can't get the nomination because that's their only port in a storm. They're saying, well, we just can't have this happen again. Well, that's what you said in 2015 and in 2016. You denied the idea that he would get the nomination. Well, the problem is denials and predictions are one thing. What actually happens is something else entirely. And now you got Joe Biden trying to say to interviewers, oh, everybody has bad poll numbers like this. Joe Biden has had a cakewalk from the mainstream media, as much as they possibly can, with all the massive failures on energy, on inflation, on foreign affairs, on climate, the whole 9 yards. And Donald Trump has stayed true to his values, and he continues to draw massive crowds to see what he has to say, because Americans want him back as president, and nobody wants Joe in the Oval Office, not even the Democrats. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.